So for this session, we're going to go over the broad general focus of sociology as a discipline. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about sociology. I'm going to introduce you to social facts and what we call social determinism. And this will set the stage for most of the rest of the material we're going to cover over the remainder of the semester. So when we talk about sociology, we're talking about a scholarly or scientific discipline that's concerned with the systematic study of social organization, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But social organization is sort of our major focus. There are two myths or misunderstandings about sociology that I think are really important that we sort of lay out and dispense with at the very beginning of the semester here. First, sociology is not the study of individuals. Certainly we collect data from individuals, and it is often data about individuals, but the purpose of the data is so that we can arrive at an understanding of the aggregate of the large phenomena we call society, not so much the individuals that make up that society. So that's the first thing that you need to keep in mind, is that while you can certainly use sociology as a mechanism to understand the behavior of human beings, especially social behavior, we're not really out to generate predictive statements or understandings of individual human beings. The second misunderstanding about sociology is that it's not common sense. I'm not sure the extent to which this is still sort of in vogue, but when I was an undergraduate, one of the knocks that people had on sociology was that we took things that people already kind of understood, and we sort of talked about them in fancier, more opaque language. That's absolutely sort of diametrically opposed to what it is sociology does, which is to try to take what people think they understand about the social world, what we would commonly lump into that category of things we call common sense, and challenge those assumptions, challenge the sort of taken for granted nature of everyday life or aspects of everyday life. And that'll be a theme that repeats throughout the rest of this semester. What we are interested in understanding are what Emile Durkheim, who's a late 19th, early 20th century French sociologist, what Durkheim called social facts. Social facts are essentially the established manners of acting and thinking and feeling that come to the individual from society. So things that we learn to put into action. And then, of course, we put them into action, which makes them sort of factual, right? A fact is just a thing that is true. So a social fact is a thing that is true of a society. And this is one of the contributions that Durkheim makes, and one of the reasons why he's a very important figure in the field of sociology is that in the late 1800s, as he's sort of charting out the boundaries of the discipline, he establishes what he calls a properly constituted theoretical object. In other words, what it is that sociologists, which, again, in the late 1800s, sociology is a relatively new discipline, what it is that sociologists are supposed to study. And what he said was, we want to study the things that are true of a society. Now, interestingly, right, something can be true of a society while not necessarily being true of all the people in that society. And that is why we talk about social facts as opposed to individual or biological facts, right? Respiration, for example, breathing in and breathing out, that's something that all human organisms do. It's not social at all, it's biological. A social phenomenon is something that we see or we can observe within a society, even if we don't necessarily have every individual member of that society engaging in that behavior. In fact, the fact that some people do it but others don't makes it much more likely that it's social as opposed to having its origins somewhere else. So this is what we're going to study. We're going to look at social facts. the patterns that are true of a society, how those patterns come to be, the consequences of those patterns, how they change over time, under what conditions, and in response to what sort of other factors in society. Everything, it turns out, in society is interconnected with everything else, which is kind of a challenge when it comes to teaching sociology, because we tend to do it through this kind of process of reduction, where we look at each individual element of society kind of in isolation, so that we can kind of properly scrutinize it and understand it and analyze it. The problem is, of course, none of the elements of society operate independently of any of the other elements of society. So that's a little bit of a challenge. Now, there are some assumptions that are built into the sociological perspective that are going to be very helpful for us to keep in mind as we proceed through the course. First is that individuals, by their nature, are social beings. Now, what that means when we say by their nature, we mean quite literally, that is our nature. We are unable to survive as organisms independent of social systems, right? If you took a newborn human baby out into the woods right after it was born and you left it under a tree and walked away, that baby's going to die. There is no instinctual mechanisms that would allow that organism to forage for food or to recognize the dangers of predators or things like that, right? So we wouldn't survive as a species if we weren't born into environments that were designed to nurture us and protect us and kind of move us along until we're capable of being somewhat autonomous. So that's the first assumption. It has to be an assumption, because even though I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think most people would probably recognize the sensibility of that assertion, we can't test that, not without violating some massively ethical norms, right? How would we do that? Experiment on a human being by raising it in total and complete isolation. I suppose technologically we could do that. We could find a way to raise a newborn human in a laboratory environment independent of human contact to see sort of what we have when that child reaches, maturity. But I think we could all agree that would be massively unethical. That would be clearly inhuman. So because we can't test it, we have to sort of leave it there as an assumption, a very reasonable assumption. As we'll talk about later in the semester, there's a considerable amount of evidence that this particular assumption, is likely a very, very accurate one. But again, that's something we have to leave as an assumption. The second assumption of the sociological perspective is that humans, right, are, for the most part, socially determined, right? So social determinism is the assumption that human behavior is explained by the greatest degree by social factors, or to the greatest degree by social factors. So the things that we observe when we watch other people behaving, those behaviors come from society. Language, values, beliefs, norms, and the various roles that people play in connection with the statuses that they occupy, right? The things that we do that are connected to the social positions that we hold. Those all come from society. They don't arise in us organically. They get expressed by us as individuals, but it's because society has given us an understanding of those expectations and the resources that we use to kind of put all of that into action. Again, we have to assume it because we can't test it, but it seems a very reasonable assumption, right? We are born, for example, with the capacity for language, but not with language per se, right? Language is something that gets acquired through the socialization process. We aren't born with values. We are capable of internalizing values and critically evaluating them and deciding for ourselves whether we want to adhere to them or alter them in some way. But the values themselves come from outside of us. They come from society. And so that's very, very important to keep in mind, is that when you want to understand human beings, a very, very easy way to do that is to understand the environments in which they're born, in which they're raised, in which they operate, because it is the environment that is the source of most of what you see them do and most of the behavior that you can observe as they interact with others. The third assumption of the sociological perspective is that individuals create, not as individuals, right, but as members of a society, create, sustain, and change the social forms within which they live their lives, right? So the structures and the culture around us, and we'll talk about both of those things in a moment, but the structure and the culture around us is adaptive. It changes over time. It changes because we have the ability to change it. There's a concept that we're going to come back to again and again in this class called social construction. Basically, the short version of that is that everything we see in the world around us is a social construct. The constructs can be built on underlying physical realities, but when we talk about things, for example, like race, or when we talk about things like social class, those are understandings of particular material conditions. The material conditions can exist independent of our understandings of them, but it is our understandings of them that we act on, right? So when we think about people in terms of racial categories or gender categories or social class, we're thinking about them in terms of our understanding of those things, not those things sort of in an objective or disconnected sense, right? So everything comes back to the importance of these social inputs. But the tendency sometimes to think of social determinism as kind of like overly fatalistic, right? We're just programmed to do what society expects us to do. That's not true, right? We are certainly programmed to do what society expects us to do, but we can also alter the programming. We can alter the practices and patterns that get established, for example, through socialization. And we can raise generations to be, say, for example, more tolerant of something that previous generations were less tolerant of, right? The very nature of social change over time is I think, significant evidence that, society is not this fixed and static thing, that it is something that predisposes us to act in certain ways, and that's where we get those patterns that Durkheim would call social facts. But social facts can change over time because we can change the nature of society. Again, not as individuals, but collectively. And that's kind of where we're going to wrap up the semester in about 8 weeks, is talking about the way in which people can change society. So what we're really going to focus on a lot in this class is understanding what we call social organization. So this is kind of the order of a social group. It's how the society is kind of structured and ordered in a way that we see the positions that people occupy and the statuses and roles that they engage in and the norms that guide their behavior. So think of those things as constraints or as limitations, right? So we get a set of guardrails that keep society kind of moving in a particular direction along a particular path, with variation within those constraints. But we want to understand that social organization and how that social organization comes to be. And there are two primary sources for social organization. The first is culture, and the second is social structure. And we're going to spend time with both of those things in this class, although I will tell you now that sociology tends to lean a little bit more heavily on structural explanations. Anthropology is sort of the field that has grappled with and often relies a little bit more heavily on cultural arguments, but those two things definitely go together. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of them again in the coming weeks. So we're going to start just quick introduction to what we mean by culture, and then a quick overview of social structure, and we can kind of start to wrap up this initial introduction. When you think about, and when other people think about culture, it's very likely that the understandings are fairly conventional. And I don't mean that in any way as a knock. I do cross-national comparative research. Specifically, I study interactions between people who are homeless and the rest of the public in a variety of places, primarily Chicago and London. This has been something I started in the mid 90s, 1996, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's an ongoing project. I continue to go into both cities, I continue to collect data. I've added other cities and other locations, but generally speaking, those are my two primary areas of fieldwork. When I present the work that I've done, one of the things that people pick up on is that there are a lot of differences between the behavior of homeless people in Chicago and the behavior of homeless people in London. And I often ask students or other people who are listening to me talk about my work to offer up some potential explanations, right? Why do we think that there are differences in the behavior of people who are homeless in Chicago versus those who are homeless in London? And somebody inevitably says, well, it's because Chicago and London are different cultures, which is absolutely true. But like any good academic, my response is always to follow up with another question, which is, why do you think, or how is it that Chicago and London have different cultures? And then people are like, well, because they're different cultures. And you can see at that moment that they really kind of didn't understand what culture was, because it was just kind of their go-to answer, right? If there's something that's happening that we don't understand, if there's something happening that we can't kind of immediately generate an explanation for, we often attribute it to culture. And that's what I mean by a very conventional approach to culture. It's one of those things that after, maybe with a little luck after this class, people will use that argument or that understanding with a little bit more nuance. But that's my hope anyway. So two ways to think about culture. The first is that culture is a product of action, which is just a very fancy way of saying we create culture. We create culture through our actions. The actions are often in response to material conditions, right? Things that exist in the world around us create limitations or opportunities for us, which we then, kind of either feel constrained by or take advantage of. And those patterns of behavior are a large part of what we would consider to be culture. So a society that is very affluent is going to be a very different kind of society than one where there is scarcity, right, in terms of their culture. That seems pretty obvious. Another way to look at culture is that it is a conditioning element of future action, which is another very fancy way of saying that culture shapes what we do. Right? The language that we use and the symbols that make up that language create for us an understanding of the world outside of us. Our understanding of the world outside of us is part of what conditions how we behave in that world. And so it's very easy, I think, to see, once you know what you're looking for anyway, it's very easy to see how culture predisposes us to make sense of the world in certain ways. So that is also true. Now, the funny and hopefully obvious thing that you guys have maybe stumbled onto at this point is that those seem to be contradictory, right? That culture is a thing that we create through our actions, but that our actions are also shaped and driven by culture. This is what we call a paradox, right? Two seemingly contradictory things that are both also simultaneously true. Get used to paradox. That's not just a feature of sociology or even the social sciences, but it does come up a lot. That what we're describing is a relationship in which there's a feedback mechanism, right? That one thing shapes the other. You need chickens to get eggs, but eggs, of course, produce chickens. That is a kind of a famous non-sociological paradox that is, I think, informative, right? That both of these things about culture are true, right? It is something that flows out of our response to things like material conditions and the nature of the external world, but it is also something that predisposes us to behave in particular ways. And we don't need to resolve that paradox for this class, But I want you guys to sort of be aware of the fact that it exists, and that culture is maybe a little bit more sophisticated than a lot of people tend to treat it. And we're going to talk a lot about culture, especially as we get into the third week of the semester. Culture, as I said, works alongside social structure in creating this organization that defines our society and other societies around the world. So let's say a couple of things about social structure. Social structure refers to the patterned and recurring relationships. That's really important, right? I want to be very cognizant of the fact that structures in a social sense aren't physical places the way that structures are in, say, architecture, right? A building or a public plaza or some other physical space. When we're talking about social structures, we're talking about the patterns that get created when people interact with one another. So when we come to, imagine a face-to-face classroom. It's a much easier sort of way to envision this than sort of in an online course. But imagine that we come together twice a week from 9:30 in the morning until 10:45 every Tuesday and Thursday at some room on Harper's campus. I stand at the front of the classroom and I deliver content. You guys sit in the chairs and you take notes and you raise your hand, you ask questions, you turn in assignments, right? Our behaviors, our interactions, right, which is the action that occurs between people. Anytime, just a pro tip, right? Anytime you hear I-N-T-E-R, inter, that means between. So when we talk about interaction, we're talking about the action that occurs between people. So when we interact, we create a college class. That college class exists for as long as we create it, right? The 75 minutes on Tuesday or Thursday when we meet, the 16 weeks or the 8 weeks or the 12 weeks that define the duration of the course. And then at the end of the semester, we stop creating that structure because we stop interacting in that particular set of constraints and that particular set of conditions. We could create another sociology class in the subsequent semester, but that would be a different class. So my point here is that when we look at social structure, we're looking at those patterns, we're looking at those relationships, not the individuals that make up the dynamic, but the dynamic itself, right? Society exists of not individuals, as Marx would say, but of the relations between them, right? The places in that social structure, in that social organization, where those people stand in relation. It's maybe the easiest way to think about it is sort of position to position rather than person to person. Might be a really easy way, or an easier way anyway, to kind of wrap your head around this idea of social structure. As I said, it arises in the form and takes the form it does in response to needs, in response to material circumstances. We have in our society a need, and it's not unique to the United States, but we have in our society a need to transfer skills and knowledge from one generation to the next. And there are lots of different ways that we do that, but one of the ways that we do that is we have a system of formal education where people go to school and they listen to content experts talk about their expertise, share the skills, share the knowledge, and then assess the degree to which people have successfully internalized an understanding of and an ability to use the skills and knowledge of that particular field. So this view, by the way, is what we call historical materialism. It's a way of understanding the kind of unfolding of how social organization comes to be. In order to survive, we have to produce and reproduce the material conditions necessary for life. And one of the material conditions necessary for life is the transfer of skills and knowledge, right? How do we know how to make and distribute the things that we need to survive, for example? So that's the nature of social structure. It arises out of our shared interactional behavior, which in turn informs how it is we are supposed to behave. When we are in a classroom situation, we know, for example, that if we're the teacher, we have to do a certain set of things. We know that if we're the students, we have to do a set of things, right? And it is It is the doing of those things that actually creates the structure. Again, a kind of paradox in which structure shapes the behavior that creates the structure. So maybe the most studied element of this in sociology anyway is what we call the institution, or the social institution. And this is the largest, short of an actual society itself, this is the largest structure that we're going to look at. So things like education, right? Not just a college or a university or a high school, not a specific class in any one of those settings, but the whole process of the sort of transfer of skills and knowledge intergenerationally. That is a social institution. Family is a social institution. Health is and media and governance and military and defense and science. All of these things are institutional features of social structure and of societies, because all of those things are common to every society in every place around the world at every point in time. Now, the particular form that a social institution takes is going to be a function of a lot of other considerations. So if we're looking at a hunting-gathering society, tens of thousands of years ago, education, you could certainly find education happening in that society, but people didn't go to college, right? You don't go to college to study how to hunt a bison or, minor in collecting berries. The education is very experiential. People who know how to do things teach the people who don't know how to do those things how to do those things. In a modern industrial society where there's highly specialized skill and knowledge built into the organization of the economy, education is similarly complex. You certainly get a general education in the K through 12 system, but by the time you go off to college, you're increasingly going to start specializing. And it's very important for a variety of reasons that not only do we give you specialized knowledge, but we also start to credential that knowledge, which is where we get degrees and transcripts and grades and that whole structure of evaluation. So social organization is going to be the thing that we're kind of focusing on, right? How does it come to be? And that's a really, really important question. It's one that people very often don't ask. But sociology kind of builds itself on approaching exactly that topic. And as we'll see as we get into this a little bit more, the consequences of that for individual members of society are that our lives are going to be profoundly shaped by how our society is organized. If we can understand how our society is organized, then we can begin to have better and more useful insights into our own lives and the lives of the people around us. And that is what we call the sociological imagination. And that's something we're going to talk about again in a subsequent class lecture. So that's about it for a kind of introduction and overview. If you guys have any questions, as always, reach out. Feel free to let me know if anything needs to be clarified. And I guess until I see you next time, have a good day.